87 M2 competition, but more specifically, it's my one. Now, if you know anything about these cars, you'll know that when they launched, they received a hell of a lot of praise. Anyone who went and drove one said how it's possibly one of the best M cars of today, and even now they're sort of receiving quite a lot of praise in the media. So it's safe to say, me buying one, I'd sort of set a very high expectation of what I was going to get out of it. Me growing up as a kid, the 1M Coupe was like one of the most desirable cars for me growing up. It was literally my poster car. So the M2 competition always sort of had itself quite high up on that list of cars I said I wanted to own. So this was something that I said at one point in my life I was going to go out there and go and buy one of these, which is probably why I chose a sunset orange one. That was obviously pretty much the launch colour for the 1M Coupe. I wasn't entirely sure what it was about this car or about the M2 competition that made me want to go out and buy one of these, other than it sort of resembled the 1M Coupe. These things to me look incredible, and everyone that was driving them was ranting and raving about them and saying how good they were to drive. I'm about 10,000 miles in, I've owned it a year. The question is it really as good as everyone says it is? Well, let's find out. When I first got this, it wasn't entirely what I expected it to be. Now, it's probably worth me giving you a bit of context as to try and help you understand why that was. So previously to this car, I had a 235i Coupe, but it wasn't a completely standard 235. It had essentially been tuned up and sort of modified in a way as to make it somewhat get as close to an M2, or at least the original M2, as it could be. So it had a limited slip diff, it had been tuned, it got better brakes on it. So it had a few things done to it to make it a little bit more serious than the 235 you get straight out of the box. And for me, that car I had zero expectations going into that. I wanted a rear-wheel drive BMW. I didn't have enough money for an M2 at the time. They were considerably more back then. So the 235 seemed like the most logical compromise. So I went into that car not really knowing what to expect. Didn't really have, I hadn't really set a high bar for it. So it's safe to say that it just over-delivered in every way imaginable. Now for me, that 235 at the time especially was everything I wanted from a performance car. It was a car that you could drive on pretty much any road because it wasn't too serious, the suspension wasn't too hard, and you could take the mickey a little bit. You could turn the traction back and mess around in it, and it was just a really good hooligan car for the road, to put it simply. Whereas the M2 competition obviously isn't that. It's a much more serious performance car, and I think me getting into this car with such high expectations of what I wanted from it, and also probably expecting it to be a 235i but better, maybe I'd set that bar in the wrong place initially. I mean, ultimately when I first got this M2, I was driving it around, trying to drive it and treat it the same way I treated the 235, but it ultimately just wasn't the same car in any way. Now, like I say, I didn't gel to this car straight away, and there is a few good reasons for that. I think when you get into this car, especially coming from a much less aggressive performance car, there's certain quirks to this car that really sort of make you go, okay, that's a bit, it's a bit out there, or it's a little bit annoying or whatever. So again, the infamous DCT that are in these, a lot of people have critiqued them, some people have praised them. I can see both sides of it. Driving around now like we are, it's sort of constantly on your case. I mean, I'm just about to come up to a junction, and as you pull away, if you don't respect it, it will sort of jolt, throw you around, hold on to the gear longer than you want it to do, and it's just not as intuitive as the ZF boxes that you get in a 235i. The main reason I tuned this car, because it's not standard at the moment. Obviously standard they come with, I think it's 410 horsepower, and I've only put a stage 1 tune on this, and it was actually only because I hated the throttle response on this. Now, some people might not agree with that, fair enough. I don't drive this car on track. A lot of the time I'm driving it and you're sort of using the throttle half-heartedly because you can't see round a corner, so you're sort of feathering it, and then if the corner's clear, you put your foot down a bit. And I just found that it was constantly jolting and lurching where the throttle's so sensitive and the ride's so hard that your foot's sort of bouncing around on the accelerator. And I just found that a really annoying driving characteristic, and something that the 235 didn't at all display. In the first few months I was sort of struggling to understand what what it was meant to be, how it was supposed to fit into what I wanted it for. It just came with a lot of quirks and a lot of things I just wasn't sure what to make of. I mean, there's so many little things with this. If you're not aware from an ownership perspective, there's a really annoying characteristic with these cars. Now, I hear rumour that the seat is actually turned a degree because it doesn't fit into the chassis the way that it does in the M3, the M4. Now, I can only assume that that is what causes an incredibly annoying squeak where the side bolster is constantly touching the armrest, and the only way to get rid of that is to have the seat raised up slightly, which then means you can't really have the best seating position that you want. And it was just little things like that I, you know, as I encountered them, sort of started to frustrate me. I didn't really gel to the DCT. This one in particular is on the competition, not the competition, the M Performance coilovers, which means that it's a very firm ride, which is great if you're on the right road. If you're not on the right road, it is just constantly jiggling and bumping around, as you'll probably see while I'm filming this. On top of that, as I say, with the throttle response, that was sort of getting on my case a little bit. So I was sort of at a bit of a weird crossroads with this car where everyone had praised it up, I'd set expectations so incredibly high, and then I've gone and got into this car and it's not exactly what I sort of expected it to be. That being said, I sort of realised that maybe it's because driving it every day, you know, driving to work, nipping down to the shops in it, whatever it might be, maybe that's what was sort of ruining the ownership experience of this, because I was never really driving it the way it was intended to be driven. 90% of the time I was driving it just as a little run-of-the-mill car. So just chucked it on the driveway, got a daily, and then I'd only ever take this out if I was going to drive it properly. And let me just tell you, when you drive this car properly on the right roads, it is one of the best performance cars you'll ever experience. The noise, which was controversial, a lot of people don't like the sound of the S55. I didn't really know if I liked it or not at first, but it's just hilariously fast. It's incredibly well balanced. Even on a really bumpy road like this that we're on here, it just sits down, it's got so much grip, the brakes are incredible. The gearbox that any other time was doing your absolute head in, suddenly it all starts to make a bit more sense. You know, this DCT is so fast on a good road, like ridiculously fast, that suddenly you forgive it for all those annoying characteristics that you've sort of experienced on the day-to-day. And it's just such a good fun car to drive. And the grip is just unbelievable. For me, this is one of the best out-and-out performance cars you can get for the money. It just does everything as well as you could possibly expect it to. Now, I know what I said about the 235, but the fundamental difference is the 235 really was a comfort car with a big engine trying to be a performance car. This is the polar opposite of that. This is an out-and-out performance car that, if you need it to, can be a practical car to some extent. And for me, that's what BMWs are all about. They're supposed to be exciting, you know, fast, affordable cars that, if you need to, you can chuck shopping in the back, you can put two people in the back of it. It can do everything. That's, for me, what BMWs were all about. You know, if you look back to the earliest M cars that were produced, they were at a price point where the average person could afford them and still use them day to day if they needed to. And that was the important point of owning a BMW, is that it was an everyday person's car. Much as I complain about all the different things in this car, that, you know, the gearbox, the throttle response, the squeaky chair, all those little things that sort of grind your gears a little bit, all things considered, I think it just makes for a perfect love-hate relationship, because you sort of drive it in the wrong places at the wrong time, and those little things get on your case a little bit. You know, you're driving through a busy town centre and the gearbox is constantly just in the wrong gear or lurching or lunging or whatever it might be, and you get a little bit fed up with it, and then when the sun comes out and you're on the right road and you really start to wind this thing out, you sort of forgive it for all those annoying characteristics. It's no surprise for me that the DCT gearbox went. If you look at the modern M cars, they replaced it with the ZF. For me, that is just a better gearbox, you know, and that was the one thing that the 235 did better than this car. As much as this gearbox is fast and engaging and it's fantastic on the right road, it doesn't really make up for the fact that 80% of the time you're going to want it to be a civilised car. I think that goes without saying. That's why the new M cars have got the ZF and they've done away with the DCT. I think something about this car gives you that sort of perfect balance for a love-hate relationship. It's going to do your head in, it's got a load of annoying quirks, but at the end of the day, it's a performance car. You take it out on the right road, you're going to enjoy every minute of it, and there is something very special about the driving experience in these cars, and I fully understand why all the journalists rant and rave about them. If you was to take this car out over a weekend and just drive it purely for driving experience, you can't really ask a lot more for the price point that it sits at, especially now. I mean, I'm in September 2024 at the moment, and you know, I don't know where the market's going to go in the next few months, but at the moment you can pick these things up for sort of mid-30s, which is an incredible car for that sort of price point, and there isn't really a lot that sits in that same price point that offers you the same level of versatility and driving experience that this does. So for me, this is a pretty unrivaled car. And yes, okay, when I first bought it, I didn't really fully understand it, and I didn't get off to the best start with it, and I was sort of experiencing all these quirks for the first time and not really knowing what to make of them. If it were me going back, I probably wouldn't buy an automatic. I probably would go to the manual, and for anyone that's looking at buying an M2, that's probably what I would say to do, unless you're purely going to drive this car on a weekend in the summer for the right reasons. The manual's just better. It's just better because you're going to be able to use it in a much more domestic environment, and it's not going to be sort of doing your head in 24/7. So yeah, with that being said, I mean, hopefully that gives a bit of insight as to what it's like to live with one of these cars. Don't get me wrong, you know, now further down the line, I love this car to bits. It has lived up to expectation. I just didn't understand it in the first place, and now that I do, it's by far one of the best cars I've ever owned.